are you? Welcome on in.
Podcast by George.
Another Podcast by George.
Podcast by George. Border to border. Coast to coast. Podcast by George.
Well, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another Podcast by George. We're on Friday morning, folks. It's always good to say TGIF, but it's always with a word of caution because Friday morning means everybody that's working remote or anybody that's having a sales meeting is doing it on a Zoom call. So the internet is really constricted, and I hope our show comes off all right today. So far, the internet has been complying. Everything looks good. And I hope you saw the little promo that I had for the show. And of course, this is an all-time favorite of mine. My God, I love Medea Benjamin. She's coming back on Podcast by George. And do I feel fortunate about that? Let's read her LiveLine intro and we'll get right to it. Medea Benjamin is co-founder of the women-led CODEPINK. She's co-founder of Global Exchange, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, Unfreeze Afghanistan, which advocates for returning the $7 billion of Afghan funds frozen in U.S. banks. And we got to talk about that sometime. I talked about that quite a while ago on my show, but here's a country that we devastated for 20 years, for God's sake, flattened it, basically. We pull out and people criticize how we got out of there. It's just a good thing that we finally ended it and we froze their money. Now, that's changed a little bit, I think. Maybe we'll talk about that today. Maybe we'll get to it later. Also, the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect. She's big on that. The National Nobel Peace Prize for Cuban Doctors campaign. Now, Medea has been an advocate for an activist, folks, for 50 years. Now, described as one of America's most committed and most effective fighters for human rights by New York Newsday, and one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement by the Los Angeles Times. She is one of 1,000 exemplary women from 140 countries nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. She's the author of 10 books, including her most recent book. Now, you're going to see that right off my left side. You can't see it right now, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. And that was co-authored with the great Nicholas J.S. Davies, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Her articles appear regularly in outlets such as The Hill, Salon, Common Dreams, and The Progressive. Her Twitter handle is at Medea Benjamin. And that's Medea, M-E-D-E-A, at Medea Benjamin. All right, let's take the graphic off of the screen. Let's click this button. And this one over here should bring her back into where we can say good morning to Medea Benjamin. Hi, Medea.
Good morning, George. Nice to be on with you.
Yeah, I've been watching you a lot on network television this week. I know you've been talking about everything that's going on. Most of it is not good. You were just recently in Ukraine. I love to get these firsthand accounts from somebody that is kind of a kindred spirit that shares a like mind. We're going to get to all of that, but let me bring this up on screen first of all, because this is ongoing. This is big news right now. This is from the CODEPINK website, CODEPINK statement on the 2023 NATO summit. And folks, if you're not paying attention to this, you should be. Now, this highlighting is mine, of course. This is CODEPINK statement. At the NATO summit in Lithuania, President Biden referred to NATO as anchors for global security. My God. Yet decades after NATO was established, we still live in a dangerous and polarized time of never-ending wars. NATO has proven it is not an anchor, but rather a catalyst for war on behalf of the U.S. empire. Okay, we'll circle back to that. But, you know, I tell people I kind of liken the world in my life and how I read the newspaper and stuff to the racing form. I tell people that, you know, you go to the racetrack and you read the past history on the horses, and some people bet their life savings on that, Medea, but it's like we're not paying attention. And that's pointed out right in this opening paragraph about NATO. This has not worked. We do not have a safer world. We're more at risk than we've ever been. And millions of people, FYI, are in the ground because of this. I don't know what to make of it sometimes. And you've been at this longer than anyone. What's your take?
Well, exactly, George. I mean, just look at this history of NATO. It's called a defensive alliance, defensive alliance, defensive alliance. It is not defensive, it is offensive. Look what they did in the bombing of Kosovo. Look what they did in joining with the US in the invasion of Afghanistan, a 20-year debacle. Look what they did in overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And now, not only so engaged in this war in Ukraine, but also at the same time setting its sights for a war with China by bringing into the NATO summit that just happened the Asia Pacific countries of Japan and South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia to bring them into the NATO fold. Remember, this is supposed to be the North Atlantic. That's not the North Atlantic, but it's part of NATO's warfare, and seeing the entire globe as its dominion for carrying out whatever kind of military activity. NATO is about warfare.
And I talked about your book at the onset, and it's all about NATO's involvement and its responsibility for the situation currently in Ukraine, which a lot of people don't understand. You mentioned Libya. A lot of people are not aware of that. My God, Libya it used to be kind of considered one of the better democracies in that part of the world, and it has just devolved since we laid hands on it, like all of these people, all of these countries have. Afghanistan, again, was a NATO operation. And then look at what's happening in Ukraine as we sit on the precipice, teetering. I mean, it's that close, folks, on nuclear war. And again, this is NATO / United States, and they're having this meeting. I got to ask you about this. Honest to God, Putin has invaded Ukraine, and he's doing what he's doing because of the expansion of NATO. So what does Biden and the United States and its NATO allies do? They get together and decide that they're going to expand NATO. Go figure. Medea, I don't get it.
Well, I like the way you put it, George. Yeah. Why don't you take what is part of the problem and throw some more problem into it?
Yeah.
Exactly. If NATO had never expanded the way that it had promised Gorbachev back in 1991, this war would not be happening today. And when in 2008, there was a NATO summit in Bucharest, and it was the United States at that time under George Bush that said, we have to invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, despite the opposition from other NATO countries who said, bad idea, bad idea. They went ahead and issued a very vague but a real invitation nonetheless. And Putin at that time, back in 2008, said that was a direct threat. And U.S. Ambassadors, U.S. Analysts, including the present CIA director, William Burns, said, this is a very bad idea. It's not only goes against Putin, but the whole Russian elite that sees this as a red line, and Russia will be forced to respond to this. And look where we are today. That's why I see this as a war not only foretold, but a war that could have been avoided in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I'm gonna hold this book up. I want to encourage everybody to read this. It's just the right size. I told Medea before we went on the air, it's not too much. You're going to be able to get through this book. It's just got the pertinent informational details that she just delineated. I mean, and it'll make you a smarty pants. You won't be a Michael Smirkomish or whatever if you read this thing. I'll never forget Roger Waters looking at him and saying, "Man, you need to read more." Well, you got to. I mean, honest to God, you got to read this book. Okay, so again, we talked briefly before we went on the air. I didn't talk about this so much, but it kind of gets at something I want to throw at Medea from right field. Now, this is Suzanne Murphy. She's saying, "Good morning, Medea," and Podcast by George, and then she's saying they want war with Russia. Okay, now. Medea, I've been telling people lately this Prigozhin situation was a real eye opener for me, and I didn't hear a lot of people talk about it in this context. But Prigozhin was leading a coup. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I heard a military analyst say that he had threatened Putin's life. Now, this is a guy, Putin, that everybody says is crazy. He's a madman. You don't threaten his life. Well, this situation, at least temporarily, appears to be resolved. And how? It looks to me like Prigozhin picked up the phone. It looks to me like they had a meeting either in person or over the phone or something like that. And it was, again, resolved at least temporarily, but tens of thousands of people aren't dying because of it. I look at the situation in Ukraine, Medea, and say, United States and NATO and Russia, why don't you pick up the phone? Why don't you make a call? Why don't you set a meeting? Why isn't there a negotiation? Well, some people will tell me, George, they're not too dumb. They're in on it. Like Suzanne says, that they actually want not only to continue this war, but perhaps to accelerate it. What side of the fence are you on that? Do you believe that that the United States actually wants this war and wants to accelerate it?
Yeah, but on the other hand, what they really don't want is to have to send in US troops or other NATO troops. And so there's this very strange position that Biden is trying to navigate, where first he says, well, we're not going to send in these HIMARS because that would just be too much. And then he gets pressure and then he sends it. Okay, now we're not going to send in these Abrams tanks because that would be too much. And then he goes forward. The same thing happening now in the F-16s. So he keeps crossing his own lines. But I certainly think that all we have to do is listen to what the Secretary of Defense Austin said, which is how we had to weaken Russia. And that is what the West is trying to do right now. But it doesn't want to cross that line, of course, to have to be directly involved. So we see this dance happening, and we saw that at the NATO summit. Now, when you bring up the issue of Prigozhin, yeah, I have a friend inside Ukraine who said the U.S. and the West should draw the conclusion of that you can negotiate with Putin, because they brought in a mediator, Lukashenko from Belarus, and they had a mediation. And as you said, we don't know where the end of this will be, but we know that so far a civil war was avoided, that many people didn't die because they talked to each other. And that's why, for whatever you think of Donald Trump, when he says, if I won, I would pick up the phone and talk to my good friends Putin and Zelensky, he gets tremendous applause from the audience because people think it makes sense. As you said, pick up the phone and talk. You have nothing to lose. And Biden has never once picked up the phone this entire time to talk to Putin.
Yeah, and to underscore, he is obviously no fan of Donald Trump, and neither am I. He has a propensity to kind of say the quiet part out loud once in a while. He'll say the truth, but then he doesn't ever follow up on it. He doesn't do anything about it. I mean, that's the way this guy is, honest to God. But he kind of does the reveal. He's kind of like he pulls the rabbit out of the hat and then he puts the rabbit back in.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous to think that he could solve this in 24 hours. Negotiations takes a long time, but he says it because it's popular. And that's the important thing to get out of this, that there are politicians who are starting to realize that this endless war is not a good thing in the context of the U.S. upcoming elections, for example. And I think more and more people in the Biden administration are starting to realize this as well. So, yes, this war has run now for 18 months, and there's no end in sight. And how much money is the United States going to throw into this? It's already been $114 billion. And they're saying that they're running out of munitions, they're running out of money. And are the American people going to keep getting hoodwinked to say, oh, yeah, let's put more of our tax dollars into this. Forget all the needs that we have at home. Let's give it to keep this endless war going that's designed to weaken Ukraine, to weaken Russia. Doesn't make sense.
I've got a lot of great viewers and people that like to comment on the show, and this is one of them, Victor Tiffany. I could throw this in anywhere, but this is right in Medea's wheelhouse. I mean, she's going to love this question because it says, ask her how to best counter pro-war propaganda on corporate media. And this is something I talk about, again, a lot on my show. I've had the great Marcy Winograd from CODEPINK on my show. And, CODEPINK's very involved in lobbying and petitioning and trying to work with these Congress people. And I tell her, I don't know. It just doesn't seem to be working. We don't seem to be moving the needle. Well, that's just one of the tools in the toolbox, so to speak. There's a lot of things that can be done. Why don't you run down some of the list, Medea?
Well, in terms of countering the corporate media, it's a very hard thing to do. We have a rapid response network in this group, Priests in Ukraine Coalition, and we respond every single day to articles that are coming out in the mainstream press, or respond on Twitter to things that we see in the TV. But really, it's easier to get on the non-corporate media and spread the word like we're doing today. And it's interesting to see things like the campaign of Robert F. Kennedy, who says that today the media is the social media, and that you can reach millions of people through that. So that's what we try to do as well. But we also feel that you have to be more visible, and there haven't been enough protests out there, whether it's in small cities, getting out in front of your farmer's market, or getting out into the town halls, or wherever here in Washington, D.C., where I am. We need more visibility. And that's certainly something that Code Pink is trying to do with what we're calling our Summer of Peace. Get people out and about doing things to show that they want to live in a world of peace. They don't want to keep these endless wars going.
Yeah, and I want to underline or emphasize you don't have to be Medea Benjamin to make an impact. I'm thinking of that farmer's market. Just wear your Code Pink t-shirt. Just walk through the farmer's market with a sign. Go put it in your car if afterwards if it bothers you, but you don't have to get arrested or be on national news to have some, impact on this. I've been in the street. I've carried signs. It ain't going to hurt you. I mean, give it a shot, folks. Yeah, go ahead, Medea.
Yeah, or just put it up in your window. We're producing
Yes.
some really awesome signs about general things about peace, or about peace in Ukraine, that you can just put up in your window. We're also producing a bunch of little flags. When the war started, you saw these Ukrainian flags all over. Well, let's see peace flags all over the place. So yeah, from very simple things like that to organize little house parties where you show some of our videos and get your friends discussing these issues. There's so many ways that people can get involved that are either part of your comfort zone or push you a little bit beyond your comfort zone. But if we're going to end war, we have to push ourselves to get involved.
Yeah, it makes me think the window sign thing makes me think of the great John Lennon, who I love. I'm a big music fan, but Lennon talked about just putting a sign in your window, and there was some express wording that he wanted on that sign. It wasn't a lot. Google it, folks. You can find it, and you can do something in memory of the great John Lennon as well. Okay, let me bring this up on screen because everybody's talking about this, or they should be anyway, and I've talked about something similar related on my show since I started it, really. And it has to do with, how change occurs in America. Richard Nixon wasn't, run out of the White House for his warmongering and the expansion of the war in Laos and Cambodia. It was for his dirty tricks and Watergate and breaking into Ellsberg's office and really kind of attempting to undermine the electoral process, which the kingmakers in D.C. take extreme exception to. And the point that I made several times is in Laos and Cambodia, they're still being blown up. Those kids are in Vietnam with these munitions that are still in the ground out there. This stuff goes on for decades, maybe centuries, for God's sake. And so Code Pink is saying, tell your congressional reps to vote no on sending cluster bombs to Ukraine. Let me see what I clipped here. Now, the White House is considering sending internationally banned cluster bombs to Ukraine in a desperate bid to shore up a slow counteroffensive against Russian troops. Instead of supporting a ceasefire and peace talks, the Pentagon is pushing to send weapons declared illegal under the UN Convention on Cluster Munitions. Okay, I've got some more stuff that I can bring up on that, but I want to get Medea to get her opinion on this, because these cluster bombs, they're illegal everywhere. I was interested to find out. I work with Brad Wolf. He has the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal, and he's subpoenaed these war manufacturers the Pentagon hires to build this stuff. They don't even build these. The merchants of death, they don't make the cluster bombs, at least here in the United States, I don't think, Medea. I saw where Textron was the last manufacturer to do that. It's been 10 years. Almost all of the world is opposed to these things. And the cluster bombs is a big issue in itself, but also, again, it's a big reveal that Biden and the U.S. military would use these things. Tell us about the clusters.
Well, I don't know how the heck they did this so fast, George, but it
Yeah.
seems like the cluster bombs have already been delivered to Ukraine. It's quite remarkable. They must have planned this for quite a long time. And yet, I think something interesting happened with this whole issue. And that is that finally we see a little bit of life among people in the Democratic Party who had been so cowed into not saying anything about this war since the time back in last October when they put out a letter saying, well, it would be nice in addition to the weapons and the economic aid if we tried negotiating, and they were slapped down. They've been quiet ever since, and now some of them spoke up about these cluster munitions. And so I feel that that is, even though we lost and they sent the cluster munitions, it's opened up a space, not only in the Democratic Party, but also internationally, because so many countries stepped up and said, we oppose this. Countries that are still suffering from the cluster bombs, like in Laos, and countries within the membership of NATO stepped up and said, we have signed this ban. We don't want you to be using it. Now, they weren't strong enough about it, but at least I think it created some cracks, and it makes people understand to what depths the Biden administration will go to try to support Ukraine. And that is by violating an international ban when the world came together and said, these munitions are so abhorrent that we as a world community say no to them. And Biden violated that. What else is he willing to violate?
Exactly. Let me take that off screen and bring me back on. Now you've got for people that don't know, maybe you've seen photos very similar to this, but this is what we're talking about here. This is one of these cluster bombs. There's a reason why over 100 countries have banned the use of cluster munition shells that contain hundreds to thousands of smaller bomblets, bomblets, my God, dropped from the air to litter areas the size of football fields. Now, these shiny bomblets often do not explode. You see them all there. I mean, I've seen estimates anywhere from 4 or 5% don't explode to 30 or 40%. The shiny bomblets often do not explode until children, thinking they are toys, because these things are scattered out over a large area here. It's like, what is this? They pick them up and they have their limbs blown off, Medea.
Well, that's right. And I've seen it in Afghanistan, in Lebanon. I've seen it in Southeast Asia. It's just horrific how, I mean, even imagine one child that gets his or her leg blown off and what that means for the rest of that person's life. And of course, people are killed when they step on these, and many of them are farmers. And these are civilians we are talking about. So that is why the world community did come together. And Biden said, well, it was a very difficult decision to make, but we were running out of artillery shells to send to Ukraine, so we have to send these. And I think people should really think very hard about this decision made by the Biden administration, all of the red lines that he crossed. But now this is one he crossed that has crossed the red line of basically the entire international community.
And again, it's a reveal for me because it shows you where the mindset of the U.S. and its military-industrial complex is. They'll use these cluster bombs that we don't even manufacture because they're so repugnant. We'll send them over there, and then the victims oftentimes are innocent farmers and kids.
And these will be Ukrainians.
Yes, that's the other thing.
About Ukraine, what we're doing is ensuring that Ukrainians will keep dying years and years to come.
Yeah, so that's a nice segue here to the next graphic, I'll bring this up on screen because Medea and the great Anne Wright, they were just over in Western Ukraine. And this is very interesting. I want to read through this just a little bit. The part that you go to the CODEPINK website and read the entire article here, but here's the part that struck me about it. The nationalism, the hyper nationalism that's taking place in Ukraine right now. And people that follow my show know that I have Serhiy on all the time. He's Serhiy Tagnarenda. There he is in front of his microphone. He's a Ukrainian musician. And he stayed behind. He sent his family off to safety in Poland, and then he stayed in his studio in Kiev. And he's a musician. I would think that he's a love and peace kind of guy. Well, maybe he is, but not when it comes to this war, folks. He's very militant. And some of what Medea encountered some of what she encountered in Ukraine was the same way. You write that the favorite drink at the restaurant is this Putin is a dickhead beer that first launched in 2015 after Russia annexed Crimea. Okay, I get that. It's beer. The label depicts a cartoonish Putin as a tattooed mafia boss sitting on a throne. Souvenir shops at the restaurant and nearby stores sell the Putin beer, heart-shaped chocolates with pictures of Ukrainian soldiers, toy grenades and tanks, and T-shirts that show Ukrainians blowing up Russian ships or giving Russian soldiers the middle finger. We got excited when we saw a T-shirt with a peace sign until we saw that underneath the peace sign were the words of shit. Okay, I want to show you that. So here we go. So see, you read it like there's piece of shit. Get it? And then here are these toys that are. Look at these. These are toys. I mean, those are pretty realistic looking grenades and bullets and that type of thing. But I thought this was interesting. It's understandable that people would have an intense sense of nationalism and hatred of the Russians. Yeah, we get that. The tremendous death and destruction that the Russians have perpetrated naturally leads to a desire to destroy all things Russian. And this is also a sentiment cultivated by both the government and the media, but it certainly makes it difficult to contemplate solutions. This is the close to the article. I got to read this. It says, our parting conversation was with a Canadian Ukrainian visiting family. So you got Canadian Ukrainian. So when we started to talk about peace talks, the gentleman put his fingers to his lips. Quiet, he said. You don't want to talk about negotiations in the midst of a conflict where people are fighting and dying for victory. Indeed, that will be the way this war ends. And you can certainly talk about this outside Ukraine. We're talking, and he's mentioning peace talks and negotiations. But here it is considered treasonous, and people are not yet ready to hear it. Hopefully that day will come soon so that all this suffering and destruction can come to an end. Now, the highlights are mine there. But Medea, I guess off the top, I would say you were in Western Ukraine. Now, if you went to Eastern Ukraine, you went into the Donbass, you went to some of these areas and villages where people were under attack by the Ukrainian government following the 2014 Maidan coup, you might not have this hyper nationalistic support for the war and for the Ukrainian government and the hatred of the Russians. Am I reading that part of it correct?
Well, yes, and let's understand that this is not new. I mean, the hyper nationalism and the hatred has only gotten worse during the war. But this is a country that has been divided for a long time between the western part of the country that is more pro-Europe and the eastern part of the country that leaned more towards Russia. And Russian speakers are discriminated against terribly now in the western part of the country. We mentioned there were stores that had signs above them that said the language of the oppressor will not be tolerated in this store. And we met people who were Russian speakers who were afraid to go out on the street speaking Russian. So yes, you would find a very different situation if you were in Eastern Ukraine. And you have to recognize that there needs to be a solution that accounts for the different populations that need to coexist inside of Ukraine, which means the people in the Donbass region have to have a chance to say how they want to be live, how they want to be governed, a referendum that is internationally supervised, and the issue of the Crimea that keeps coming up. And we found in Ukraine, people were totally irrational when they talked about Crimea because they said that belongs to Ukraine and we will get that back. When you look at the the real chances of Ukraine getting back Crimea, well, it's a very, very difficult thing to contemplate because the Russians are just not going to give that up. In fact, there are generals who said if the West tries to help Ukraine in getting back Crimea, there is a real likelihood that the Russians would use a tactical nuclear weapon. So is that really where we want to go? Or do we want to give the chance of coming to a negotiated solution in which, yes, there will have to be territorial compromises, but isn't that better than moving us in the direction of a nuclear war?
Yeah, you can't underscore that enough. It goes back to the comment that I made earlier. This is everybody will run around and tell you how much of a madman, a crazy person, how unstable Vladimir Putin is. He's a former KGB head. He's, a spook over there in Russia. He's already invaded Ukraine. So what are we going to do? Poke this guy some more? We're going to continue to provoke him. What do you think he's most likely to do? Oh, nobody would ever use nuclear weapons. Well, I got news for you. If there was ever anybody that would, it might be this guy or his inner circle. And some of those people are crazier than he is. Honest to God, I don't know what people are thinking about. Now, before we leave Ukraine, I want to play this because I've got this clip. It's only 22 seconds, folks. So watch this.
Tell us about the efforts the State Department has made.
Clip. Let me bring this up. Here we go. Play.
Here we are outside the cemetery where the fallen soldiers just from this one town of Lviv have been buried. This is since the war began. Very, very tragic.
Yeah, it's a very somber moment there. And the body count is horrific. And I don't know if a lot of people in some places of Ukraine are even aware of it. I don't want to criticize the Ukrainian people for their hyper nationalism. I want to remind everybody that during World War II, people in this country slaughtered dachshunds, the dogs, because they thought because of the German connection, for God's sake. I mean, and Germany wasn't even on our soil. But here you have Russia and Ukraine, and they are somewhat hyper nationalistic. Now, the other point that I make on my show, Medea, and I talk about the New Deal and I talk about Vietnam in particular, the way that those things changed wasn't electorally, as I mentioned. Hell, I don't know if Nixon and Kissinger probably still have us in Vietnam, but it was the fact that people did what Medea does. I mean, that they got out there and made a ruckus about this in the streets, and that's how the change came about. And it was because everybody was being affected. People were starving to death in the Depression, and everybody in Vietnam was starting to have a kid come home in a box on their block. And so finally people said no mas, no mas. Do you think that type of thing could and would happen in Ukraine? I hate to put it in this context, but if the body count continues to escalate the way that it is, that something may get done eventually?
Well, I think it's more likely to happen in Russia, where people are not defending their homeland, and where we've seen before how Russian mothers have been the backbone of a movement to say, stop war, when they're trying to find the bodies of their dead sons. So I think in Ukraine, because they are, for the most part, defending their territory, this war will go on as long as the West keeps funding it. And that really brings us back to our role in the US, because if our government were pushing negotiations, there would be negotiations starting tomorrow. And our government instead has sabotaged negotiations at various different points when the war could have ended. And so our job really is to be pushing our government, our elected officials, and, not leave it to the extreme right of the Republican Party to be the ones that are saying, let's get out of this war, let's stop the constant funding, let's not send the F-16s. Let's make sure that this is a nonpartisan issue, and the only way that they're going to speak up is if they start feeling the heat.
That's a great explanation, and I tell people that all the time too, particularly when it comes to MSNBC. It's like there's not a single Trump supporter or Republican that's watching your network. You're not going to influence or change anyone's mind on this show. This is called choir preaching on this network. I mean, my God, uh, affect the change where you can affect it. You don't have any effect over Republicans. Who might you have some influence on? Ah, the Democrats, the elected representatives, the people that appear regularly on your show. Why not try preaching at that choir once in a while? I mean, I make that point all the time on my show. I also want to bring this up. Let me see if I can get it on. Yeah, that's great. So here's the book, folks. This is what I was talking about earlier. And I wanted to hit just a very quick couple of excerpts from the book here. Let me get it to come in. And this, I should mention that Medea co-wrote this with the great Nicholas J.S. Davies. So, and this is just off my scanner, so folks, bear with me here. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was indeed brutal. Nobody disputes that. Barbaric and illegal. But what of the brutal, barbaric, and illegal invasions in which the U.S. and its allies engage? It kind of dovetails nicely with what I was talking about, Medea. But my God, instead of yelling out the window at no one, how about looking in the mirror for a change, Medea?
That would be good, wouldn't it? Because the way this is portrayed is it's the good, meaning the West, versus the evil, which is Russia. But the US and NATO have engaged in so many brutal, barbaric, and illegal wars that the American public doesn't even quite remember that. You know, we've often been characterized as the United States of amnesia, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, because the invasion of Iraq was only 20 years ago. The invasion of Libya was less than that, and yet the American people think that we are the good people. We don't do things that are illegal. We follow the international rule of law. And it's just not true.
Okay, so one more excerpt here before I leave the book, and everybody, I'll put a link, as they say in the description below, when I get done with the interview here. But I wanted to bring this up because this is towards the end of the book when Medea and Nicholas are kind of summing things up. And I highlighted this. It says, Westerners supporting endless shipments of weapons to Ukraine sincerely hoped, and maybe it's the tense here, but sincerely hope to defend Ukrainian freedom and sovereignty. Okay. Medea, I cite this movie all the time on my show, Casino. People get tired of me talking about it, but Robert De Niro, great show. There's a scene in there where he confronts his slot machine manager for allowing 3 machines to be run in a row. And he looks at the guy and he says, are you too dumb or are you in on it? I mean, either way, you can't work here. And I kind of look at this with these politicians and these people sending these endless shipments of weapons to Ukraine. And you could make an argument. You could say, well, they're too dumb. But the people on the far left will say, nah, they're not too dumb, George. They're in on it. Again, Medea, where do you come down on that?
Well, I don't know what you mean by in on it, but I think that we should recognize that our entire government is in on the military industrial complex, and that so many of our politicians, Republican and Democrat, especially those who are on the Foreign Relations Committee or in the Armed Services Committee or Appropriations, they get money directly from these these weapons contractors. And let's not forget the revolving door. I mean, just look at the Secretary of Defense, who came from us directly from the board of directors of Raytheon. So they are in on it to the extent that, unfortunately, a lot of the power brokers in this country make a lot of money from war.
Okay, we're going to run out of time with Medea here. Yeah, I mean, that's what I meant by saying that they're in on it. They're not doing this by accident or mistakenly, that they're actually doing this purposely, again, to get at that soft underbelly, just like they tried to do in Afghanistan, of Russia, this proxy war concept, which has been proven copacetically, irrefutably, not to work and to do anything but harm us. Let me bring this up on screen because this is it's not a hand from the grave, but I kind of was. I did a head snap when I saw the news come down on this too, and I know Medea had to. My God, this guy was in the news when I was covering it back in the 1980s. This Elliott Abrams guy. Again, this is a reveal for me. This is from the CODEPINK website. Tell your senator, dump Elliott Abrams. President Biden nominated Elliott Abrams to a key advisory committee on diplomacy. Elliott Abrams knows absolutely nothing about diplomacy, says CODEPINK, as he's made a career of lying and making policy that led to the death and suffering of innocent people from Guatemala to Iraq. He embraces militarism, covers up for gross rights abuse, and has a history of supporting all of the wrong sides of every issue. Now, here it is talking about his being on the wrong side of the situation in Guatemala. It was so brutal that it was classified a genocide by the United Nations. That's Elliott Abrams, folks. He denied that the Salvadoran military was responsible for the devastating massacre where in 1981, a U.S.-trained battalion murdered more than 500 civilians, slitting the throats of children along the way. He is vehemently anti-Palestinian, shamelessly supports Israel. He repeatedly undercut any U.S. pressure on Israel to stop the building of settlements. Now, this is what I wanted to get to, and I'm going to turn it over to Medea here. In 1991, Abrams pled guilty to withholding information from Congress related to his involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal. Hell, a lot of my viewers aren't old enough to even remember that, but go look it up on Google, and Oliver North and Reagan and all this, the secret and illegal scam in the 1980s to siphon profits from Iranian weapon sales to support the right-wing Contra rebels trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. The guy pled guilty. I mean, this is somebody that is convicted, for God's sake. And the way that I put it to people on my show, Medea, I use it in terms of, Brennan and Clapper, those guys that are on CNN and MSNBC. They not only admit these things, they're charged, and Abrams maybe even did a little penalty for it of some type. Again, read the racing form of history, folks. Medea?
Well, it's just mind-boggling. I read it and I said, oh, this is a joke. This is the Onion. And then you see these excuses from the Biden administration. Well, you have to put a couple of Republicans on this commission. And so, this is the one that they nominate. Come on. I mean, it's just absurd that Elliott Abrams would be resurrected to be on something that has something to do with diplomacy. It makes absolutely no sense. And it's a slap in the face to all of these people who have suffered from, as we said, Guatemala, El Salvador, Israel, Iraq, and Venezuela more recently, where he was made an envoy for U.S. policy in Venezuela, where he supported coups, he supported sanctions, he sabotaged any kind of talks with the opposition. So he is a one evil man who should not be allowed to step into a government office.
The thing that jumped out at me, I read over it very quickly, but this guy is one of the primary proponents and supporters of the Iraq War. You know who else was? Our president, Joe Biden. Yeah, exactly. And people overlook that fact all the time. And Medea, I talk to people again, are they too dumb or were they in on it? A lot of people, well, they were just too dumb. They didn't realize what the circumstance in Iraq. They thought there were weapons of mass destruction in there, and they went in under the best intentions and just got mired, in this huge swamp in Iraq. And it was a mistake. I look at it and say, nah, it wasn't. There was that guy, what was his name? Hans Blixt, I think, the UN weapons inspector, that was telling everybody that would listen to him, and nobody was, hey, there aren't any weapons. We can't find any. You guys just wait. Hang on a minute here. I mean, we're going to wrap these investigations up, but so far we haven't found a thing. And nobody knew. Hell, I knew. I was in the street with a sign, my wife and I, back then. Medea knew. She was there, but the current president of the United States, we're supposed to believe, did not know because he was misinformed, because he was too dumb, or again, Is he in on it? I mean, that's the question that I come back to all the time, Medea.
Absolutely. I mean, he was in the inner circles for decades. He
Yes.
was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was the one who proposed dividing Iraq into three pieces. I mean, he's definitely got this imperial mindset. And now he says, well, he didn't really know, and he stopped supporting the war. Come on. I mean, he was a major proponent of U.S. involvement in Iraq, and was never held accountable, just like the ones who were directly responsible, like Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld, were never held accountable. And, now there's so much talk of holding Putin accountable, which would be nice. But it's hard to take when it's coming from the United States, that has never been held accountable for so many war crimes that our leaders committed.
That's great. I got to continue to. We got to wrap up here because we're running out of time. Medea's time is very precious. Like I said, she was on national television here almost all this week. Okay, so let's talk about this again to get people involved. You think, well, what can we do? If we've got these evil forces against us. Well, one very easy, simple way to dip your toe in the water and get involved is to go to CODEPINK, throw them a few bucks. I do. Buy a T-shirt, buy a book. But also do this, Medea. Tell us about the Pledge to Peace, the Summer of Peace.
Well, this is a lot of fun that people can have because we are producing such great art and images. We have one that I love that says "Make Peace Cool Again." We have wonderful flags that people can put out. We have all kinds of ideas, and people are giving us their own ideas. So we're talking about 500 actions during this summer, and I think we'll surpass that easily. Go onto the website and look at codepink.org, Summer of Peace, take the pledge, join us. And you can also look at peaceinukraine.org, which is a coalition that we are part of. So there's lots of ways to get involved, and we need your help.
Great. And Medea will be out there on the front line like she always is. I got to play this clip because I've played this on the show before. I mean, I just love this. But to me, this is great stuff because, I like to consider myself a tough guy because of my upbringing. And I, play hockey with some guys that are always wanting to fuss and fight and carry on. And they think they're tough guys. But I've got this clip. I want people to watch this. This is the definition of tough. Watch this, folks.
Tell us about the efforts the State Department has made to get Evan free. And in particular, I'm curious whether you've been able to talk.
Excuse us, we can't use this day without calling for the freedom of Julian Assange. The Biden... Stop the extradition request for Julian Assange.
2 hours and not one word.
Take it easy, take it easy, take it easy, guys.
Not one word about journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was murdered
So-
by the Israeli
so-
occupation forces in Palestine.
We're here to celebrate freedom of expression, and we just experienced it. Let me continue, Mr. Secretary, to ask you about Evan Gershkovich and your efforts to get him free.
Yeah, but they're missing the point because she's talking about Julian Assange. And of course, they were there to talk about freedom of the press or whatever. But these issues, even that we discussed on the show today, a lot of this would not be known if it weren't for people like Medea, CODEPINK, journalists, people that are allowed to go out and report on this type of stuff. And Julian Assange is right at the top of the list. We talk about him all the time. The importance of this cannot be under or overstated. It is highly important, significant. And I know this is a big issue with you, Medea.
Well, it's funny on that clip that you showed. I don't know if your viewers and listeners realize there was a period of silence there. And that's because they turned off the mic, which is quite funny because the whole event was to celebrate freedom of speech and freedom of press. So anyway, yes, this issue of Julian Assange is so important. Just a couple of days ago, I was out with my co-founder of CODEPINK, Jody Evans, and Ben & Jerry founder Ben Cohen, where they got arrested in front of the Department of Justice calling for Julian's
Yes.
release. And these are, the kind of beautiful actions that people are taking all over the country and all over the world, where people are saying this is just horrific that the Biden administration is still going through trying to extradite Julian Assange with charges up to 175 years in prison, when Biden was vice president under Obama, and Obama decided to not push the extradition charges, and now Biden is. So we've got to scratch our heads again and say, what is this administration doing? And continue to build up the pressure to be against this extradition, to drop the charges against Julian Assange. We must see Julian Assange freed.
Yeah, and I think off mic, maybe it was when they were trying to kill the mic. I was somebody in your group. Maybe it was you. Somebody I think I heard yell Shireen Abu Akleh. Also,
No,
talk
that
about
was
her.
my partner, Tag Barry, who went up on the stage with me. And she was a Palestinian journalist, very, very loved in Palestine. And she was murdered by the Israeli military. And there is no justice that has been done for her murder. She had a very, very clear vest on saying press.
Yes.
And a helmet on, and they attacked her, and the U.S. has done nothing to try to force her accountability. So the U.S. is so selective on where they care about journalists and where they don't care about journalists. And unfortunately, Palestine is one of the places where they don't care, because the Israeli government has carte blanche to kill civilians, to kill children, and to kill journalists.
Yeah, the great Julian Assange and Shireen Abu Akleh. And I, right after that occurred, I had Chris Hedges on the show, and he was first to point out, now this guy that was the Middle East bureau chief, he's a war correspondent all over the world. He said, nah, this wasn't random fire. No, this wasn't an accident. No, this wasn't the Palestinian friendly fire. This was an Israeli sniper, because as Medea points out, the bullet was tucked right underneath the bottom of her helmet and the top of her flak jacket from, a distance. Somebody with a rifle and a scope and knew how to use it, intended expressly for that purpose. The great Shireen Abu Akleh, may she rest in peace. Well, maybe that's a good place to leave it. And you've been very generous with your time. I've had the web addresses and URLs up on screen. I'll bring some of those up. If you want to give us a closer here, Medea, give us a wrap up, and I'll put some of these things up on screen.
Well, I guess I want to repeat that this is a summer that we have to turn up the heat and advocate for peace, and that we need as many people involved as we can. So please contact us, join us. You can see from Code Pink, we actually oftentimes have a lot of fun when we do this work. It's serious work, but we try to build community and make people feel that they're part of a very positive movement that's going to turn around this country from being a warmonger to one that learns to cooperate with other nations around the world. So thank you very much, George, for your time.
It's always great to have you on, and I don't want to impose. I also, maybe you mentioned this, but Shireen Abu Akleh was a U.S. citizen, right? I mean, this is an American we're talking about.
That's right. And Julian Assange is not a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
Why is the U.S. trying to extradite an Australian?
God, it is a house of mirrors that we live in. Let's let her go, folks, because she and I could talk all day, but I want to save this for a time when we can get her back on. Medea Benjamin, thanks again for coming on this Podcast by George.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you. Bye-bye, George.
Yeah, folks. And if you like Podcast by George, if you like seeing folks like Medea Benjamin and, talking about her book and her great works and a little video snippet and that kind of stuff, please go to podcastbygeorge.com and subscribe on all of my various platforms and channels absolutely free. You can watch the videos, these live streams, free on Facebook and YouTube. Just click the badge, the icon for that. You'll be able to sign up very easily. Leave us a comment, ring the notification bell, as they say on YouTube. And most importantly, share the show so that we can get a little additional reach for Medea and also for Podcast by George. And if you just like the audio, the long form audio, the interviews, like the podcast today, and you just want to hear these while you're out biking around, driving your car, jogging, whatever the case might be, go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up on iTunes, Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Deezer, Stitcher, all of those places where podcasts are heard. But that's going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.